She froze as he dropped to one knee, not in a ballroom, not under a chandelier, but in the middle of a library, surrounded by children holding a small velvet box with a sapphire ring nestled inside. I held a door open. Once he said, "You walked through it, and everything changed." The room went still, a little girl whispered, "Say yes." And through the tears, through the trembling, she smiled 1,000 times. Yes. But this story, it didn't begin with a proposal. It began with disappointment, with a terrible date, a slammed door, and a stranger who noticed more than anyone else ever had. If you've ever wondered how a single moment can rewrite everything, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now let's begin. At 34, Elena Moore had learned how to spot a disaster before the second glass of wine was even poured. And yet she had ignored every quiet instinct, every inner tug warning her not to say yes to this date. Now, as she pushed her chair back in the middle of the Marlowe, a pretentious downtown bistro lit more for atmosphere than comfort, the legs of the chair screeched sharply against the marble floor, a sound too honest for a place that preferred whispers. "Remarkable," she said under her breath, reaching for her handbag with one hand and with the other gathering the remnants of her self-respect. Across from her Nathan Rhodes, a 40-something financial consultant with too much gel and too little tact, looked up blinking as if he couldn't quite grasp what had gone wrong. "What did I say?" "You asked if I always eat that slowly?" Elena replied, her voice steady, and then without even a pause told me I should cut the carbs if I want a second date. He gave a quick laugh, as if trying to soften the blow of his own arrogance. "It was just a joke." Her eyes didn't flinch, and calling your ex-wife a trial run, was that also a joke? She didn't wait for an answer. Some things didn't deserve one. Elena stood up. Her heels met the floor with sharp certainty as she turned away. She didn't care that heads turned. Let them. Let every woman in the room witness what dignity looked like when it refused to stay silent. The glass door at the front was heavy, but before she could reach it, someone held it open from the outside. "Thank you," she murmured without looking, brushing past a tall man in a dark tailored coat, phone in hand. He was only a silhouette to her sharp edges, deep presence, and eyes that followed her a beat too long. He watched her disappear into the night, something unreadable crossing his face. Elena didn't glance back. The cold air greeted her like an old friend. She walked until she reached the dim levels of the parking garage where her aging sedan sat, waiting like it always did, dependable, unimpressive. Hers. She leaned against the car door and exhaled slowly. It wasn't heartbreak that weighed on her chest. It was the quiet grief of wasted time, of giving people a chance to treat her like less than what she was. Back inside the restaurant, the man who had held the door stepped into the warmth and glanced toward the table where Nathan sat smirking over the bill. He didn't know her name, but he had seen something in the lift of her chin, the calm in her refusal that left an imprint. 3 days passed. Elena lost herself in the quiet rhythm of her work at Easton Public Library. The job didn't pay much, but the books never asked her to be anyone else. They were simple, safe kind, in ways people often forgot how to be. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, her best friend Clara leaned over the front counter with a crooked smile. "You know," Clara said, "there's a whole world out there beyond these shelves. I stepped into it last weekend," Elena replied without looking up. "It mocked my meal choices and called emotional baggage a punchline." Clara winced playfully. "Okay, fair, but hear me out. There's an art opening on Friday. My cousin's helping organize." She got us on the guest list. Elena raised an eyebrow. "You know, I don't do mingling with champagne and strangers in bow ties. You'll borrow a dress, sip overpriced sparkling water, and pretend we're interesting. Just for one evening." Elena gave a reluctant laugh. "Fine. But only because you said sparkling water instead of wine." The evening felt like a borrowed dream. Elena adjusted the neckline of the midnight blue dress Clara had loaned her and stepped through the tall glass doors of the Viridian Gallery, a luminous structure in the heart of the city. From the outside it shimmered like a jewel box. Inside it glowed with elegance too polished to feel real. Waiters glided across the floor like dancers balancing trays of champagne and canapes. A string quartet played something delicate in the background, and the room pulsed with the low hum of curated conversation. Everyone looked like they belonged, beautiful, composed, glossy, in ways that didn't bend under fluorescent lights. Elena didn't feel like one of them. Still, she took a flute of champagne with a small smile, raised her chin, and wandered toward a quieter corner, pretending to study a painting she couldn't quite make sense of. "Striking piece," a voice said beside her. Calm, rich, and unmistakably familiar, she turned, and her breath caught. It was him, the man from the restaurant entrance. Tonight he was dressed in a black tailored suit that fit him like intention. His eyes, the color of early evening storm clouds, studied her with a quiet that felt almost reverent. "You were at La Branche," she said slowly. "Half sure this was real. I was—" He nodded, a flicker of a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You walked out like the building was on fire. I was just lucky enough to be standing near the exit." A laugh slipped from her lips before she could stop it. Startled. "Real. Sorry. If I nearly took you out with the door." "I'm not sorry," he replied simply. She blinked. "Why not?" "Because now I get to meet you properly." He extended a hand. "James. Whitmore. Elena." "Moore," she replied, her voice quieter now. She placed her hand in his warm, steady, and for the briefest second, the noise of the gala fell away. "So, what happened?" he asked gently, nodding toward the empty space beside her. "Your date that night, was he truly as awful as he looked?" She hesitated. "He talked more about his ex-wife than he did to me. Told me to lay off the bread if I wanted another shot." James exhaled sharply through his nose. "Charming. I thought so too," she said dryly. "Come." He gestured toward two high stools set near a quiet alcove. "Sit with me. I promise not to critique your carbohydrate choices." She smiled despite herself. "That's a painfully low bar. Every solid foundation starts somewhere," he quipped, and something about his tone made her follow without thinking twice. They sat, and something shifted. James asked questions, not small talk, but questions that carried weight. Not once did his gaze drift in that way men sometimes do, scanning a woman like a product. Instead, he listened closely, kindly. As if her words mattered, and Elena, she found herself laughing. Really laughing, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. 2 hours passed like 10 minutes when a waiter swept by with a tray of delicate hors d'oeuvres. Elena eyed the offerings skeptically. "You look like someone craving real food," James said, watching her. She gave a small, caught smile. "You're not wrong. I know a place." He offered. "No dress code. Quiet. You won't need to pretend." She hesitated. "You don't even know me. I know you walked away from someone who didn't see your worth. That tells me more than most ever do." Her heart paused just briefly before catching again. "All right," she said softly. "Lead the way." Outside, he handed a valet ticket to a man in a black jacket. Moments later, a sleek, dark sedan pulled up to the curb. "This is yours," Elena asked, eyes wide as she slid into the seat, inhaling the warm scent of leather and cedar. He shrugged. "I like quiet rides." She glanced sideways. "You're not just some guy who opens doors, are you?" James smiled faintly. "I own a few companies, nothing dramatic. How many is a few? Depends on the week. 5, maybe 6. She stared at him. "So you're wealthy." "I am," he said. Not boastfully, but with a quiet honesty. "Is that going to be a problem?" She considered that, then shook her head. Only if you expect me to be impressed, I don't, he said, glancing at her again with that same steady gaze. I just want you to be comfortable and maybe a little hungry. She laughed, warmth blooming in her chest, unfamiliar and welcome. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't bracing for disappointment. She wasn't performing. She was just herself, and that was enough. As the car pulled away from the city's glittering center, winding through quieter streets lined with iron balconies and lamp-lit sidewalks, Elena looked out the window and then back at the man beside her. She didn't know where this night was going, but for once she wasn't afraid of the unknown. Do you trust me enough to get out? James asked, glancing toward her with a quiet smile. Elena looked over at him from the passenger seat, her lips curving just slightly. I'm already in the car, she murmured. Might as well see where the mystery goes. The building they stopped at didn't look like much from the outside, brick walls laced with ivy. No sign, no crowd. But the moment they stepped in, the world seemed to exhale. The space inside was dim and warm with wooden beams stretching overhead like open arms. A pianist played softly in the corner notes, floating like candle smoke. Only a handful of tables filled the room, each tucked behind velvet curtains that offered privacy without shutting the world out completely. A server greeted James with a knowing nod and led them to a booth near the back. Elena slid onto the bench, fingers brushing across the linen tablecloth as if to anchor herself. You come here often. Now and then, James said, the chef's a friend. People don't ask questions here. That sounds like a luxury, she replied, settling back. I've had more than my share of being asked the wrong ones lately. James leaned forward, elbows on the table, gaze steady. You work with books, don't you? Her posture shifted ever so slightly. How do you know that? You had ink on your thumb at the gallery, he said simply. And you smelled like lavender and old pages. That combination doesn't come from perfume. Only people who live among stories carry it like that. She tilted her head. So you're observant. And a little unsettling. He smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. Moments later, the server returned with a tray of warm dishes, roasted root vegetables, herbed bread, still steaming something golden and delicate she couldn't name but fell in love with. At first bite, Elena tried to eat slowly, but the food was honest, in a way she hadn't tasted in weeks. You eat like someone finally being fed after a long winter of instant noodles and emotional exhaustion, James said, eyes glinting with quiet humor. That's disturbingly accurate, Elena replied, tearing off another piece of bread. My stove's been broken for a week. I've been living on crackers and caffeine. He laughed, then a sound so genuine and unpolished that it made something soften in her chest. You live alone? He asked. She nodded. Just me and a cactus named Jasper. He thrives on neglect. It's a perfect match. No roommates, no pets, no noise, no chaos, just quiet, I get that. James said I tried having a dog once. He outsmarted half my board members. We both knew it wouldn't last. She raised an eyebrow. Wait, you have a board. I run a few companies, he said. Tech logistics media. Depends on the day. So you're one of those people who can't sit still. I sit still, he replied softly when something matters. She looked at him, then really looked. And does this matter? He didn't blink. It might. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It hummed with something unspoken. Elena reached for another plate. Well, she said lightly, if you're trying to seduce me with roasted squash and fresh butter. It's working. I was aiming for honesty, he replied, but I'll take seduction as a happy accident. They lingered. Not because they had nowhere to be, but because neither wanted to leave. When the last notes of the piano faded and the lights dimmed further, James rose and opened the door for her once more. This time when she looked at him, her eyes didn't question. They simply stayed. You always like this? She asked, holding doors, saying things that sound better than fiction. Only when I mean it. The drive back was quiet. Not awkward, just full. full of something they hadn't named yet, but both could feel. He didn't ask to come in when he stopped in front of her apartment. "What now?" she asked, hand on the door handle. "That's up to you. I don't do flings, neither do I. I'm not impressed by wealth." "Good," he said. "I'm not offering it. I don't let people in easily. Then let me start where it matters, at the door." She studied him for one long moment, then nodded once and stepped out. When she glanced back, he was still watching. No pressure, no expectations, just there. Inside, Elena leaned against the door for a breath. Her cactus sat in the windowsill, silent and unmoved as always. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't call Clara. Instead, she filled the kettle, made a cup of tea. Her hands still trembled, not with nerves, but with the echo of something new. Across the city. James stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his apartment, a glass in hand. Watching the lights below blink like distant stars, he didn't know what this was yet, but for the first time in a long while, he wanted to find out. That night, James stood alone in his high-rise apartment, a glass of bourbon untouched in his hand. Through the vast windows, the city glittered below like 1,000 quiet possibilities. But it wasn't the view that held his attention. It was the echo of a conversation, the feel of her laughter. The way Elena looked at him, not like a man who had everything but like a question he hadn't answered yet. For a man who calculated every risk, who built his life on logic and control, it was an unfamiliar sensation. Curiosity, and that was rare. The next morning, Elena found an envelope slipped under her apartment door. No return address, no markings, just her name written in careful slanted handwriting that seemed oddly intimate. Inside, a single ticket. Admission to the city's rare book exhibit, sold out for weeks. Alongside it, a small note on heavy cream paper. "Since you spend your days giving stories to others, I thought I'd return one to you, Jay." She stared at the words, her breath catching. She hadn't told him where she lived. She hadn't even mentioned the exhibit. And yet, he knew. Not in a way that unsettled her, but in a way that reminded her someone had listened. Someone had noticed. For the first time in longer than she cared to admit, Elena didn't analyze. She didn't retreat. She got dressed, and she went. The gallery was quiet, reverent in the way that libraries and cathedrals often are. The scent of aged paper mingled with polished wood, and the soft lighting bathed everything in a kind of sacred glow. Elena moved slowly, her heels silent on the thick carpet. Her eyes wide as she passed display after display of first editions, leather-bound volumes, and delicate handwritten manuscripts. Each case seemed to hold something timeless, books that felt alive under the light, but it was the centerpiece that stopped her breath. A 19th-century edition of Celtic folk tales illustrated by hand, the edges of the pages gilded like something sacred. She had told someone once, a lifetime ago, that stories like these had shaped her, that as a child she had escaped into their pages like they were doorways. She hadn't remembered telling James, and yet here it was. She stood motionless in front of the case, her throat, tight eyes shining. "You look like someone trying very hard not to cry in public," said a voice behind her, gentle, familiar. She turned. He was there. In a dark coat, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable but kind. "You weren't supposed to show up?" she whispered. "I wasn't supposed to know where you live either," he said with a small shrug. "But apparently we're already bending a few rules." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "How did you even get a ticket to this?" "I didn't," he replied. "I own the building. The curator owed me a favor." She blinked. "Of course you do. Do you ever just buy a regular ticket and wait in line like everyone else?" "Lines make me nervous," he said, eyes glinting. "Too much time to change your mind." She turned back toward the case. "This is a lot. I thought it might be," he said softly. "But I also thought you'd understand what it meant." She didn't answer. Instead, she moved to the next display. Her heart still racing, not just because of the books, but because of what it meant for someone to see her this clearly. To remember something small, something real, and not use it against her. By the time they stepped back out into the early evening, the city had changed. It buzzed with a kind of bright electricity, the kind that only exists when the air feels full of possibility. James didn't ask if she wanted to go somewhere. He simply walked toward his car and she followed. This time, they drove uptown past the restaurants and galleries into a quieter part of the city. The building they stopped at was wide and carved in granite with soft Art Deco lights glowing at its edges. A doorman greeted James by name. In the elevator, Elena folded her arms. "Where are we going now?" He pressed the top button. Somewhere still, the elevator opened into a private foyer. Beyond it, a penthouse wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the entire skyline. The setting sun poured gold across the marble floor and warmed the edges of everything it touched. "You live here?" she asked, taking in the view. "Sometimes," he said, "I come here when I need to think. It's not home." "Not really?" "Of course it isn't," she said under her breath, and he only smiled. He handed her a glass of something amber, then poured one for himself. She took a sip and walked slowly to the window. "How long have you been this successful?" she asked. He joined her at the glass, the city stretching endlessly beneath them. "Since I was about 25, he replied. "But I've been trying to build things since I was a kid." James sipped his drink slowly, his gaze anchored to the skyline. Lights flickered endlessly beyond the glass, stretching like a quiet constellation. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more grounded. "I've been obsessed with building things since I was a kid." Elena turned toward him curious. "What kind of things? Anything that gave me a sense of control?" He said, "My childhood was noise. My parents were unpredictable. I learned early that if I created something with my name on it, no one could take it from me." She studied him, something soft flickering in her chest. "You're not at all what I expected. I hear that a lot." They stood in companionable silence, the city glowing around them like a sea of stars. "I don't usually let people in this fast," Elena admitted. "Neither do I," James said. She set her glass gently on the ledge. "Then why now? Why me?" He didn't hesitate. "Because you don't flinch when someone shows you the truth," he said. "Most people see money and start trying to become whatever they think I want. You're the first person in years who didn't care about what I have." She met his eyes steady and sure. "I care about what you do with it." Something shifted behind his expression, something raw, real. "Come with me tomorrow," he said. "There's something I want to show you." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to tell me what it is?" "No." "Is it legal?" His laugh was deep and unguarded. "Very." At dawn, they left the city behind. Elena wore jeans, an old wool coat, and a cautious heart. James didn't offer directions or details, just drove one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on the console between them. Eventually, they turned onto a gravel road, winding through quiet hills. At the end stood a wide greenhouse nestled behind a weathered stone building that looked like it had once been a school. She stepped out, blinking in the soft morning light. "What is this place?" she asked. James glanced over, his tone quieter now. "A literacy center," he said. "I funded it about 5 years ago. People assume I just cut checks, but I come here every Saturday." Inside, the space was alive. Children sat curled in beanbag chairs, their fingers tracing the edges of picture books. Teenagers typed quietly at aging laptops. Volunteers shelved stories like they mattered because here they did. A few kids ran up to James and threw their arms around him without hesitation. He smiled as he handed one of them a stack of books. "You're kind of a secret superhero," Elena whispered as she watched him. "I don't do capes," he murmured back. They wandered the aisles. On one wall, notes were pinned. Thank you cards, scribbled quotes, faded crayon drawings. One showed a rainbow with crooked letters that read, "Books make me brave." Elena reached out and touched the edge of it. "This," she said, her throat tight. "This is why you do it." James nodded. "When I was 8, a teacher let me keep a book I couldn't afford. It changed everything. I wanted to give that to someone else." She turned to him, her heart rising in her chest. "You're not who I thought you were." He looked at her gently. "Who did you think I was?" "Another man who used money to build walls," she whispered. "But now, I think you use it to open doors. For the right reasons." They didn't speak for a moment, not because they had nothing to say, but because something deeper settled between them. Not spark, not infatuation, recognition. The sun was already leaning west when they drove back toward the city. The silence in the car wasn't heavy. It was full with meaning, with a question neither of them had the words for yet. Elena glanced over, her voice soft. "I still don't know what this is." James didn't take his eyes off the road. "Neither do I," he said. "But I want to find out." She nodded, her breath steady. "Me too." The next morning, he showed up again, this time with a thermos of coffee and 2 headsets. Elena blinked at the small helicopter behind him, wind tousling her scarf. "You're not taking me to a private island to sell my organs, are you?" James laughed, adjusting her headset. "You'd be a terrible victim." "Too many questions. I'm also surprisingly strong, I believe you." They lifted into the air. The city fell away beneath them, shrinking into a scatter of rooftops and early light. Elena looked out at the horizon, then over at the man beside her, and for the first time in years, she let go of the need to know what came next. "You'd be a terrible victim," James said with a quiet smile as he adjusted the microphone over her ears. Elena glanced at him from beneath her scarf, the wind tugging at its edges. "Too many questions." He nodded. "And you'd escape. I can see it. I'm resourceful. I don't doubt it." The flight lasted less than half an hour, but by the time the helicopter touched down, it felt like another world. The chopper settled gently on a stone helipad set against the edge of a cliff. Before them stood a coastal estate wrapped in old stone wild roses, climbing up its terraces, and beyond it, the sea endless blue-gray alive. Elena stepped out, the wind tearing through her braid salt clinging to her lips. She turned toward James, eyes wide. "What is this place?" He looked at the house with a softness she hadn't seen before. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She left it to me." She paused, absorbing that. "You brought me somewhere personal." "I did," he said. "There's something I need to say, and I couldn't say it anywhere else." Inside the house whispered rather than boasted. They passed through archways and sunlit halls where faded paintings leaned gently on the walls and shelves sagged with worn books. This wasn't luxury meant to impress. It was a life lived fully remembered in corners and creaks. Eventually, they stopped in a glass-walled sunroom overlooking the cliffs. Light poured in soft and forgiving. The ocean below moved with a rhythm that felt older than time. James stood with his hands in his pockets as if anchoring himself. "I've spent most of my life keeping people at arm's length. It's easier to feel in control that way. Easier not to lose anything." Elena leaned against the window, watching the wind stir the seagrass. "What changed you?" she asked, her voice almost lost to the wind. "You did," he said simply. "You didn't try to impress me. You didn't want anything from me. And you didn't let me hide behind the money. You made me want to show up fully." She said nothing. Not yet. He took a slow step toward her. "I've built companies, foundations, partnerships. But when I met you, I realized I'd never built anything that mattered outside of that world. You made me want more." Elena turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "And what do you want now?" "I want to build something with you, a life, a future, something real." She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched for just a breath too long, and James's jaw tensed slightly until she reached out and laced her fingers through his. "I don't want a life built on grand gestures," she whispered. I want one built on the quiet things, on showing up, on choosing each other, even when it's messy. I can do that, he said without hesitation. She looked up at him. I believe you. He brought her hand to his lips. For a moment, the only sound was the sea wind tapping gently against the glass. That afternoon, they walked the cliffs behind the house. Their boots sank slightly into damp grass as they moved through wind and silence. Elena asked him questions she'd never dared ask anyone about the first time he failed, the last time he cried. He answered every one. Then it was her turn. She told him about her dreams, not the polite, edited versions, the real ones. The stubborn ones she'd buried beneath rent routines and fear. He listened like her words mattered, and for the first time she believed they did. 2 weeks later, back in the city, James invited her to a private event. It wasn't a gala, not a fundraiser. It was the launch of a foundation, a new one in her name. The plaque unveiled read, the Elena Moore Literacy Trust. It came with grants, resources, a future for libraries and kids who needed books like she once had. Elena stood in front of it, throat tight. You didn't have to do this, she said when they slipped away from the cameras. I didn't. He agreed I wanted to. I don't even know what to say. Say you'll share it with me, he murmured. Not just your work, your quiet, your chaos, your life. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but she didn't look away. Yes. Months passed. They stood together in the library where she used to shelve books alone after closing. Now it gleamed new shelves, new tech, and a new wing named after his mother. Children giggled and raced between the aisles. Elena sat cross-legged on a bright rug, reading aloud to a group of kids curled up on beanbags. When she finished, she looked up. James stood at the door. Not in a suit this time, just jeans, a soft gray sweater and something small in his hand. A velvet box. She rose slowly, heart thudding. You're not really doing this here, she whispered. He walked toward her, stopped in front of the circle of children, and knelt down. Inside the box, a simple ring, a single sapphire. I once held a door open, he said. You walked through it, and nothing's been the same since. I don't want another day without you. The kids gasped. One little girl whispered, Say yes. Elena laughed, tears slipping freely now. Yes, she said, 1,000 times yes. When he stood to kiss her, the whole room erupted in applause. And for the first time in her life, Elena wasn't wondering what came next. She already knew. Elena froze. James stood just a few steps away, a small velvet box in one hand, and something unspoken in his eyes. Her heart stuttered. You're not really doing this here, are you? She whispered. But he was already moving, closing the distance, dropping to one knee before her, and the wide-eyed circle of children still seated on beanbags. He opened the box, inside a ring. Simple, graceful. A single sapphire surrounded by a quiet constellation of tiny diamonds. I held a door open once, he said softly. You walked through it, and nothing's been the same since. I don't want to live a single day where I'm not walking through every door with you. The room held its breath. A little girl leaned forward, eyes round. Say yes, she whispered. Elena laughed, tears sliding down her cheeks without apology. Yes, she said, her voice trembling and whole at once. 1,000 times yes. When he stood and kissed her, the entire room erupted. Children cheered, someone clapped a little too hard, and the violinist in the corner missed her cue. But none of that mattered. For the first time in her life, Elena wasn't wondering what came next. She already knew it was him, always him. The wedding wasn't held in a hotel ballroom, not on a beach or beneath chandeliers. It was in the courtyard of the Literacy Center, the place where she had first seen James, not as a man with money, but as a man with a heart. Spring had arrived in full bloom. Wildflowers climbed the trellises, ivy curled along the brick, as if it had waited all these years for this day. There were no celebrity guests, no headlines, just chairs dressed in white, tied with pale blue ribbons, just people who mattered. Clara sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, smiling through every tear. Children from the center clutched handmade paper bouquets, whispering in awe as Elena walked past them. Her gown was soft ivory. It didn't sparkle. It moved flowing like water when she walked. Her hair was swept into a loose twist, and tucked just above her ear was a single sapphire pin, a quiet echo of the ring now on her hand. At the altar, James waited in a navy suit that fit like it belonged only to this moment. His hands were clasped, his eyes steady. As she walked down the aisle, she didn't see anyone else, just him, always him. Their vows weren't scripted, no poetic flourishes, just words spoken softly, steadily, meant only for the other. You, he said, are the only thing I've ever built that makes me feel whole. Her hands trembled in his. You held the door, she replied, and I will never stop walking through it with you. He closed his eyes for a single beat, as if trying to remember the moment forever. There were no tears. They didn't need them. The promise lived in the way their hands fit, in the way their eyes never left each other's, in the hush that wrapped around them just before the officiant smiled and said, "You may kiss your wife." And when he did, gently, completely, the courtyard filled with laughter and cheers. Even the violinist let out a laugh and lost her place again. That night, under strands of warm lights hung from tree to tree, they danced. There was no choreographed number, no spotlight, just two people swaying slowly in the middle of the courtyard, foreheads touching, while the soft notes of a string quartet wrapped around them like a memory. You haven't stopped looking at me, Elena whispered into his shoulder. I never could before. James murmured, now I don't have to pretend I'm not. She pulled back her eyes, searching his. Are you still trying to impress me? He shook his head. I'm trying to deserve you. She kissed him. Not because anyone was watching. Not because it was expected, but because she would never stop loving the way his hands grounded her, like the world was steady beneath her feet. They didn't leave in a limousine. They walked hand in hand through the quiet streets just beyond the center, past warm street lamps and shuttered shops. The city felt like it was holding its breath for them, hushed, gentle. Halfway to the car, Elena kicked off her heels with a sigh of relief. You're going to ruin your dress, James said, amused. It'll survive. She grinned. It's fabric, not armor. I was talking about my feet. He laughed. You married a woman who doesn't care about blisters. She looked over at him, her voice quieter now. And you married someone who makes you want to be better every day. Back at the penthouse, James led her to the rooftop. It wasn't decorated with flowers or candlelight. Instead, it was lined with spirals of books, all from their favorite collections, stacked in gentle circles like memory and meaning. In the center stood a simple table, 2 glasses of wine, 1 cherry pie. Her favorite. You didn't, she said, laughter bubbling up as she lifted the lid. I did. James replied, no cake, just this. They sat barefoot, full of something deeper than just food. The city sparkled beneath them, shifting like it was dancing just for them. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Months passed. Then a year. Elena didn't leave the library, not really. She stayed, but her world expanded. A quiet promotion led to something larger, and eventually she oversaw the entire district, not because of who she'd married, but because of who she had always been. James, too, changed. He didn't stop building, but he started building differently. Fewer boardrooms, more classrooms. Once a week, he taught a mentorship program for students who reminded him of who he used to be before success, before control. They bought a brownstone with stained glass windows, and a staircase that creaked like it was telling stories every time she climbed it. Her cactus, now named Jasper, lived in the kitchen window, slightly tilted, but still stubbornly alive. One afternoon, Elena came home holding a letter and blinking away quiet tears. James found her sitting on the back steps, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded and handed him the letter. "A girl from the center," she said. "She got into college. Said the book I gave her changed everything." He sat beside her. "You've always been changing things." She looked out across their small yard, the light golden on her face. "I think I want to write a book," she said. "Not about us." "Not exactly. What about then?" She smiled softly. About the door. About how sometimes it's not about walking into something new. It's about walking out of something that was never meant for you. James rested his chin gently on her shoulder. "Then write it," he said, "and I'll be the first in line to read it." Years later, they sat side by side at a cozy bookshop tucked between two cafes. Her debut novel stood proudly on the shelf behind them, its cover simple, its title understated. A line of readers wound through the store hands, clutching copies, eyes filled with the quiet reverence stories often inspire. James held her hand under the table, tracing small, slow circles on her palm. A young woman stepped forward, nervous, hopeful. Was it based on a true story? Elena smiled, the kind of smile that knew too much and still chose wonder. It was based on the truest thing I've ever known. And as James looked at her, surrounded by pages, by people, by the quiet miracle of a life they had built together, from nothing but timing truth, and a door held open at just the right moment, he knew she wasn't just the love of his life. She was the story he'd been waiting to live. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks or perfect timing. Sometimes it begins with a door. One that opens when you least expect it and leads you somewhere you never dared to dream. Elena didn't need someone to save her. She needed someone who saw her, who listened, who stayed. And James. He didn't need to be admired. He needed to be understood, to be chosen not for what he built, but for who he quietly was beneath it all. Together, they didn't chase a perfect life. They built a real one, page by page, step by step, hand in hand. If this story touched you, even just a little, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Because sometimes all it takes is the right story at the right moment. Thanks for listening. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and keep your heart open.